even before we went into the pandemic, we were seeing a number of issues and trends that were starting to emerge, whether it was on the US-China trade relationship and its implications for other relationships, whether it was on the economic competition or the geopolitical competition for global leadership that had been playing out over the past couple of years. All of that has, I think, been sharpened by the dynamics of global leadership and global engagement around the pandemic and the response to the pandemic, the economic disruption caused by the pandemic, and the types of engagements between nations. To have this conversation and explore this conversation at a time when we're seeing heightened tensions on the US-China front. We're expecting the administration in the United States to be announcing some policy actions with response to the situation in Hong Kong. We're seeing some tensions on the India-China border, and in fact also on the economic and commercial relationship between those two countries. So I think it's a fantastic time to explore a little bit more in depth what this means and how we look at American leadership in the post-COVID world and what that means. We're really proud and privileged to have with us just a very eminent group of speakers and to really bring this conversation in sharp focus. We've turned to our lead experts in all matters of foreign policy, the managing. First of all, I think it's fantastic that policy putting out South Asia. That's a very important analysis that foreign policy is putting out on the for those of you who aren't already subscribers to that, please head over to foreignpolicy.com and subscribe. I think it's really good content. And Ravi, I know you've also been posted in India and have a book on how the smartphone is transforming the world's largest democracy. So really pleased to have you with us today, and I know you are two speakers who are both very eminent and who have published recently on the issue of America in the United States, the USIBC has been close attention to because of the implications on not just our aerospace and defense work, which is very keenly observing all of this, but also on the larger economic and trade issues and economic partnership between our two countries. I want to also just shout out to APCO for their participation, not only Tim Roemer's leadership and thought leadership and participation here today, but as a very important and active member of the U.S.-India Business Council as well. With all of that said, let me turn the program to Ravi. Ravi, thank you so much for joining us and moderating this conversation.
Nisha, thanks for that very generous introduction. Thanks for having me back at USIBC. Those of you who are joining this call today, thank you for giving us your time. Happy Friday. As we often have to say these days, I hope all of you are doing okay and that you and yours are safe. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to introduce two excellent experts, Ashley Tellis and Tim Roemer, who many of you surely know. USIBC has brought us here today to discuss the topic America in the post-pandemic world order and the future of global partnerships in the 21st century. A lot of big themes there for all of us to think about, but we'll hone in on some ideas specific to India, obviously, given the interests of this group. Now, I'm going to put forward just one framing thought. As Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, put it, only in a crisis, actual or perceived, do we get real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies. That was Milton Friedman. I think our basic function today is also to think and develop new ideas. It's become conventional wisdom now to imagine that the pandemic will automatically transform the world and geopolitics, but we don't know in what direction. And a lot of that depends on, quote, the ideas lying around. So let's get started. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. The troop buildup along the border with India and China is one of the main stories this week, so we'll certainly focus on that in the beginning. But we'll also jump around a fair bit after that and bring in your questions. We'd love to hear from you. So house rules, click on the chat button, type in your questions. If you'd like to ask it yourself, make that clear, and I will try and come to you if that's possible. And if not, I will ask the question on your behalf. So at any time, starting now, you can type in your questions into the box and I'll come to you. So our guest today, Ashley Tellis, he holds the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has also served on the National Security Council staff as Special Assistant to President George W. Bush. And Tim Roemer is currently the Executive Director and Strategic Counselor at APCO Worldwide. He's a former 9/11 Commissioner, also served as U.S. Ambassador to India between 2009 and 2011, previously 12 years in the U.S. Congress as representative for Indiana's 3rd Congressional District. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Let's start with your opening statements. You have about 7 minutes each, and then we'll get to Q&A after that. Ashley, I'd like to ask you to go first.
Ashley, you'll have to unmute.
Thank you. Let me start by thanking Nisha and USIBC for hosting this webinar. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here with Ambassador Roemer and to engage in this conversation curated by you, Ravi. So it's a pleasure all around. The point that you just made, that our choices will be shaped very much by the ideas that are around, I think is a wonderful leitmotif for my own thoughts this morning. And the key point I want to make is that the post-pandemic world is not going to arise simply fortuitously. And it is certainly not going to be created by the virus, no matter how powerful or how disastrous it is, but fundamentally as a result of the choices that we make at this time. And there are 3 dimensions of choice that I want to emphasize, particularly for the United States as we go forward. The first choice has to do with respect to regenerating the US economy. There's no question that this pandemic is going to take a huge toll of the economy in terms of growth, in terms of employment, and so on and so forth. And the best studies that we have now about how societies have reacted to pandemics, those studies are actually quite disconcerting because they show that the lag effects of pandemic on economic allocation those lag effects don't just last for years, they last for decades. In fact, the average lag effect is about 40 years, according to the best studies of how societies react to pandemics. It's another way of saying that this pandemic is going to take a long toll on US power and its capacity to make a comeback. Soon after the pandemic struck us, there was a lot of optimism that we might be able to make what is called a V-shaped recovery, which is we will be able to snap back into renewed economic growth, renewed employment, and we would be back on our feet. It's not obvious to me today, unless we are lucky enough to find a vaccine or treatments quickly, that a V-shaped recovery is actually in our future. And depending on how we treat the question of reopening, we could actually be faced with renewed spikes of infections, which would really destroy individual confidence and would prevent that V-shaped recovery that everyone is hoping for from coming about. There are also going to be consequences in terms of the expansion of the American welfare state, which is, I think, long overdue anyway. But one of the consequences of that expansion is going to be a remarkable pressure on US defense budgets and our broader ability to maintain the international system through the use of defense instruments. And this is something that we ought to think about. That is, it's going to be much more difficult to manage the international order in the way that we did before. So the first point I want to sort of leave our participants with is that the choices we make with respect to how to deal with the pandemic in the here and now will have long-term effects on whether we can actually snap back in terms of economic regeneration, growth, and so on and so forth. The second point really has to do with the whole question of state capacity and state competency. The United States is such a powerful country and has been an exemplar for what efficiency in the macro sense has been now for at least 100 years. Our society is fundamentally decentralized. That is our great strength, individual initiative, personal freedoms, and so on and so forth. And yet this decentralization, which is usually our greatest strength, can be our Achilles heel in the context of a pandemic, because the pandemic, more than many other tragedies, requires very strong responses from central authority or from apex governing institutions. And I think the record so far has been somewhat dispiriting, that we have not enjoyed the leadership that allows us to make hard choices, that allows us to respond coherently across our diversities, whether they be differences in states, differences in income, differences in location, and so on and so forth. This is not to say that the United States has lost its mojo. I mean, there are amazing examples of flexibility, of responsiveness at the state level, at local levels, and so on and so forth. But certainly at the apex levels of the executive branch, we have not performed as well as we should have. And this is important because it seems to me that exactly at the time when the state is making a comeback, in the management of society, in the management of the economy, in the management of international relations, because of the pressures of the pandemic, the absence of a coherent leadership, a decisive leadership, a careful leadership will take a toll on our ability to make the comeback that we would like to see, not just for ourselves, but for the international order at large. The third point, which is worth keeping in mind, is that the long-term trend, irrespective of how the pandemic sort of evolves, is that American relative power is going to diminish. This doesn't mean that the US economy will not expand, but there has been a diffusion in power in the international system now going back many decades. It is likely that this pandemic will maintain that trend, if not accelerate it. What that tells me is that our ability to preserve a global system that is orderly, that provides benefits for all, and that enhances our own standing will deeply depend on our capacity to build up a network of friends and alliances. The United States is simply not going to have the power to do things alone, as we did post 1945, when we were half the global product of the world. This means that the importance of taking our friends and allies seriously becomes even more imperative. And unfortunately, in the last few years, this is an asset that we haven't paid as much attention to as we have. If we continue to look at friends and allies as burdens rather than as assets, in preserving a liberal order that serves our common interests, I think we will end up being the bigger loser. Now, what does this require? I think this requires first that the US take its leadership obligation seriously, and that it works to uphold an international system not because it's a favor we do for the world, but because the international system actually is the first line of protection for our weaker allies. The United States is powerful. We can afford to sort of subvert the system when it serves our interests. But our weaker allies don't have that luxury. They need a stable international system for their own prosperity. And that requires US leadership in terms of preserving that system. And to the degree that we make those investments in protecting the international order, it induces our allies to enhance and increase their own contributions to it. So we can't be going to our allies and beating them up for increased burden sharing if we are not willing to do our own part. All this is, a way of providing caution that we are in the midst of traumatic change, and the choices we make with respect to how we manage our economy, the choices we make with respect to how we respond to the pandemic in terms of state decisions at the highest levels, and the choices we make with respect to our partners and allies are going to make a huge difference in terms of how we move forward.
Ashley, thank you so much for those opening remarks. There's so many big themes and issues there to chew on for us. I have so many questions before we get to those. Ambassador Tim Roemer, if you could give us your opening statement, 7 minutes or so. You'll need to unmute yourself first, sir. There you go. I think you're still on mute.
How about now?
We can hear you. Thank
All
you.
right, great. I've done a million Zooms, but this is a new one, Ravi. Nisha, thank you for your leadership at USIBC and our active participation from APCO. We look forward to many more events like this. Ashley, your paper, which I hope people will get a chance to read, is superb, and it's always a pleasure to engage with you on ideas and thinking about the future for U.S. Foreign policy. Ravi, we go back to your days on CNN International in New Delhi back in 2009, 10, and 11, and always a pleasure to have you guiding our discussion here this morning. And I do want to thank all the participants. I think Nisha said there were over 150. We value your time, and we hope that you get a chance to participate with your thoughtful questions at the end of this. My paper, which I hope people will get a chance to read, is Pandemics, Black Swan, and Predictions. And it is an exercise, not something to try to make me look smart, looking into a crystal ball to predict things, because I will obviously be wrong. But it's more of a New York Times crossword puzzle, or maybe even as I served on the Intelligence Committee, we had Global Trends 2030 and 2040, which made us try to think about what options were taking place in the world, what changes were barreling at us that would give us opportunities to think about U.S. foreign policy and national security 5 and 10 and 15 years down the road, and what choices we could make now to positively influence that direction. So today I want to talk about 5 trends that I will predict, probably with varying accuracy, maybe all wrong, but hopefully the 150 people listening, you and your CEOs, your CFOs, your government affairs offices, you can have a stimulating discussion about what these changes might mean, what options you have as policy makers, as policy participants and contributors, and people who can influence the process in positive ways, whether that's coalition building, whether that's the relationship with India moving forward, or whether that's trying to define a new China relationship. Historians don't agree on much, just like economists, but they do almost universally agree that epidemics create more widespread and lasting change than anything else, including wars. So here are my 5 ideas, and if you read the policy paper, I have more crammed in there. Here are a few to just get the discussion rolling this morning. One, rising inequality and rising anger. As the COVID-19 virus spreads, infecting millions in the United States and killing over 100,000 people, there's been a triple whammy on our middle class, especially in the Midwest. Globalization, the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and now massive unemployment for working people. If you watched Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, on 60 Minutes 2 Sundays ago, he said something that was absolutely staggering. He said 40% of the jobs of people making under $40,000 a year are gone. And many of those are not coming back. So this rising political and economic anger is going to create more disparities, not just in the United States, but around the world. And there is great speculation that rising hunger in Africa and the Middle East will displace the deaths of COVID-19. So the political resources, the safety net issues, the role of government, all these things are going to be increasingly active in our debates in the presidential election and further in, and in debates around elections in other countries. Second, no safe harbor. Yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, an estimated 67% of workers at US technology companies are concerned about losing their jobs to digital capacities powered by artificial intelligence and robotic software. The tech companies, as we know, if tech employees are worried about something, they are oftentimes a harbinger of problems that will spread to the rest of the economy. So this is not limited to blue collar jobs that may fade away or vanish or come back after COVID-19. This is an ongoing problem for budget spending and welfare issues across the world and across the globe. How are we going to deal with these kinds of issues? And they take time away from policymakers when we'd like to be thinking about longer term infrastructure investment. How do we bring back higher education? What's the combination of online learning and in-class learning? What are the new certificates that allow people to get jobs and certify them in a 3-month period rather than a 2-year community college period? What is the role of the CEO and the businesses in this? A company like Walmart educates thousands and tens of thousands of people over the last 3 or 4 years. What are the roles of these corporations in helping us deploy and train the workers of the future? That is a key issue. Third, Code War, not Cold War. The Cold War is over between the United States and the Soviet Union, but that's being replaced by a Code War between the United States and China. There will be fierce competition between the United States and China for artificial intelligence, domination of the technology of the future. We're seeing this play out with the United States going after Huawei and the Chinese coming back and saying, we have a policy to dominate technology by 2025 and 2030. What will both countries do in terms of the decisions on Hong Kong? The concept of the re-education camps in Western China are becoming more and more of a point of divergence in the relationship between China and the United States. The economic glue since 1979 between the United States and China has been trade and the economic issues. That has plastered over some of our ideological disagreements. But with that economic glue fraying and disappearing, the other more tangible geopolitical issues are rising to the top, such as spying and cyber and South China Sea and Tibet and Taiwan. Those issues of national security are being able to dominate the discussion now. That will also, as Ashley alluded to, create opportunities for the United States to reach out and form more partnerships and coalitions with other countries in ASEAN and Australia, who is also having a trade war with China, for us to create these kind of partners and coalitions to replace crumbling World War II institutions that used to create coalition building in the world and partnerships. Fourth, there will be dramatic change in brand, business, and lifestyle. We're going to see an acceleration of the trend toward a cashless society. More people probably buying online. What does that mean for brand allegiance and brand awareness? I think we can all relate to this. There was a survey before going into COVID. People in America were asked, will you drink more alcohol during the pandemic? 20% of Americans said yes. What does that mean for that brand? How do the brands then try to digitally and other means bring people and business into their venues and attract more business and revenue to their profitability and to the revenue scale? We're going to see people want to join rather than just consume. People want to be a part of a business rather than just be a buyer of a business. What is that joining up? Wearing a t-shirt, buying the mug, buying the stock, defending that company on social media. How does that change the debate in the C-suite level of what decisions CEOs have to make and how quickly they have to make them now compared to 10 years ago? And then finally, I think we're going to see national division, local leadership. Let me try to end on a positive note. If we all thought that partisanship and poison and toxicity was rising in our politics today, often reflected in the United States Congress being somewhat dysfunctional, we're now seeing even opportunities for that toxicity and division to grow more. Immigration, anti-immigration attitudes are not going away. We're going to see trade wars continue to be a divisive issue, pulling people apart. But there are opportunities, despite all this division, to bring people together on individual issues. That businesses, Ravi, you quoted Milton Friedman, what ideas are laying around where local businesses, international businesses, philanthropic organizations, not waiting for the national leadership that is so divided, where can they form these partnerships and coalitions on climate, on education, on other critically important issues to solve problems and create those solutions and work them out at the local and the state and the business level to show optimism and hope and opportunity moving forward. I think India-US relations are a key area for this natural partnership to grow in the years ahead. I think there are many opportunities to increase this trade and defense and national security relationship. We can talk more about that in the question and answer period. And in ending on a note of optimism, I do want to say that I am optimistic and hopeful. As President Lincoln tried to tell us, our obligation as Americans is to pass on a stronger democracy to the next generation. We have to fight for that every day. We have to work for that every day. And hopefully that will be one of the things coming out of this COVID-19 crisis, where Americans come out with a united opportunity to restore our democracy, create this great republic, and repair it, and also repair capitalism. Thanks, Ravi.
Thanks so much, Ambassador. Those were really a smart and wide-ranging set of comments that will help us guide the rest of this conversation. I just want to make clear to everyone on the call that this call is on the record. I should have made that clear at the start, but of course our speakers were aware of that. And I know we have reporters on this call as well. We'd love to hear from you. I see some questions coming in already. For those of you who have questions, you can type them in using the chat button anytime starting now. and I will try and incorporate those questions into the discussion. I'm going to begin with a couple of my own. I want to ask Ashley first. Based on your opening remarks, I thought it was interesting that you said that American power will diminish, but that the pandemic is going to accelerate that process. So what other things are being accelerated? Who will replace, if American power is diminishing, who or what will replace that power in the global order? Ashley.
We may end up in a world where we do not have any clear replacements for American power. And I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing. You could end up in a world where the old institutions remain, but as skeletal structures without capacity. And no alternative power is yet capable of replacing the United States. I mean, all power is relative, right? When one looks at China, for example, you see that China is hobbled by enormous constraints. And while it is likely to do better than we are in the near term with respect to an economic comeback, that's at least a plausible hypothesis, there's no assurance that China will be able to run and win the race over the long term. So it's important to keep in mind that relative decline of the United States does not mean replacement by China as an alternative hegemon. So you could end up with a variety of possibilities. You could end up with a near-term situation where no one really dominates the system in ways that are helpful. You could end up with the US making a comeback if we are lucky and if we are smart, and that's not an outcome you want to rule out. It's certainly an outcome we want to work towards in partnership with others. Or you could end up with a wide diffusion of power throughout the system with almost multipolar, as it were. I'm not exactly confident that is something that we will see in the next decade or the next 2 decades. But it is something we need to take seriously if we look beyond the next several years.
And Ashley, what does that do to multilateralism then? What does it do to international bodies that, try and bring countries to the table and shape global policy?
Well, multilateralism works best when the principal stakeholders remain invested in it. If the great powers of the day, no matter what their number, do not see value in multilateral institutions, those multilateral institutions are not going to be able to deliver. And we have seen the diminishing power of multilateral institutions in the last few years, simply because we have turned our back on many of them. It's important for the US to understand something. Multilateral institutions are not a favor we do to the international community. Multilateral institutions are a device for getting our way while economizing on the users of hard power. And so a smart American policy would actually invest in multilateral institutions because those multilateral institutions don't take away your freedom of action. As long as you're active, as long as you're engaged, you stay in the multilateral institutions in order to shape the world that you want to create. But if countries like the United States, if countries like China, if countries like the European Union do not make those investments in multilateralism, I fear we will have shell institutions that don't deliver when they're most needed.
That's quite a warning. Ambassador Roemer, I thought it was very interesting how you described rising inequality and anger about the financial system as real concerns during the pandemic, but they were also pre-existing concerns. And the reason why I'm framing it this way is that, in part of your remarks, you were saying that pandemics are, change-making moments more than even wars. And again, as we were saying, for change to take place, you need a group of people who are willing to take action. So, for example, in the 2008 financial crisis, many would say that we missed an opportunity to really take enough action to address much needed fiscal reform, inequality, other concerns. Do you think this time is different? So do you see the pandemic being cover for wider systemic changes in the financial system?
Well, I worry about past trends, Ravi. After World War II, the United States and the people of the United States came together, and it lasted years and years and years. After the attacks of 9/11, that unity lasted a year, several months. Now we have, after COVID-19, talk of red states or blue states getting aid and others being pushed away. Our unity lasted hours, not days or years. So that trend is a very troubling one, and one that points toward the possibility that without the right leadership, we will not take advantage of the next decade. Our middle class, as I said in my opening remarks, has been absolutely vanquished, devastated, almost eliminated, many falling into poverty. And so the next decade, whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration, I would advise them to concentrate on having a decade of rebuilding the heart and soul of our country. And that is the education and the infrastructure and the opportunity and the values and the responsibility of our working class people through higher education reform, tax reform, the kind of things that Theodore Roosevelt did in the progressive era with Democrats and Republicans coming together in the early 1900s. Going back to your question to Ashley, I just can't resist getting in on this, Ravi. I would be the contrarian and say that I would disagree with the premise of your question. Never count out the United States on a comeback. I think they're poised in many ways with leadership at the national and the local level for that comeback. And I think China has more vulnerabilities than the United States does. They just increased their defense budget by 6% up to, I think, $178 billion. That's probably over $200 billion with national security and homeland security issues. We are 3 times that. We have the best higher education system in the world. We have the best economy and the fastest, growing invention patent system in the world coming out of Silicon Valley. There are so many things going in our favor not to have a decline if we can get the right kind of innovative, creative, bipartisan leadership that is needed going forward.
I concur with that completely.
But those are big ifs you just mentioned there, Ambassador. I mean, in some senses, doesn't the pandemic response and the fact that the United States has so many epicenters of breakouts and the highest number of cases, the highest number of deaths, doesn't that response in turn, as Ashley was saying, hasten the notion of American decline, or at least of American prestige?
I don't think so, Ravi. I think it could, but I don't think it necessarily does. Look, the strength of a republic, a representative democracy that we created over 235 years ago, that India also has, is the epicenters of power distributed throughout the country. The state system that Thomas Jefferson talked about, the states are laboratories of democracy. We've seen the states do different things in terms of their response to COVID, in terms of their response to opening schools, their response to higher education, when it opens, how much we go back online, how do we have a hybrid education system going forward to bridge us to the future. So we not only have that in our governing system and the opportunity for governors and state legislators and leadership to come up through the grassroots, we have that in our businesses. And businesses need to be confident and have a concrete path forward to rise up and form some of these coalitions on climate? Where can they work together to define the future for us on climate and work with other countries, trade with other countries? States and governors can still work with India and still work with China on climate issues, despite what the Trump administration has done on the Paris Accord. There are opportunities if we grab them, if we recognize there are solutions and coalitions going forward, and there are specific areas that we can plot forward, and power in numbers, and power in local leadership, and power of new ideas. And the consumer is one willing to join now. They're showing that they want to participate in this through digital efforts and through other manners and forms. So leadership has to take advantage of this vacuum.
Can I offer one thought on this, Ravi, because I want to come at it from a different perspective. I agree with everything that Ambassador Roemer has said, but that presumes that we can recover a broad middle in American politics. If you can construct a broad middle in American politics as it existed during the Cold War, then we can, in fact, create that sort of winning coalition that allows us to do many of the things that, that Tim has outlined. What I find worrisome is not that we don't have latent strengths. Of course, we have national wealth, we have innovation, and we have resourceful populations. But we have become fundamentally a society that is divided, and where the peak is not in the middle of the bell curve. We rather have two bell curves at the edge. And if that divide persists, and if the American political class sees its own survival in terms of accentuating that divide rather than breaking it, then it is going to be virtually impossible for us to do what Ambassador Roemer wants. And unfortunately, that is the problem we have. We are unable to create that minimum winning coalition in the center because we've got such a polarized polity.
So let's take the discussion outside of US politics for a second. Ashley, I want to ask you about the India and China situation. It seems like on Wednesday, there was a high-level conversation between leaders on both sides, and that seems to have diffused some of the tensions. We got some calming remarks from the Chinese ambassador to India. I want to ask you, Ashley, why did we see such a buildup of troops by the Chinese to begin with? What led to this, and what does that portend in the coming months and years?
If I could answer the why of the question, Ravi, I should be picking stocks for your retirement fund.
I'll ask you that question.
It's really hard to tell, but there are a few strands that one can bring together. One is simply weather. This is the time when winter is behind us, when access to difficult valleys in the high Himalayas has opened. And it offers opportunities for China to do things that it could not have done in the months preceding. But that's a background condition because the Chinese could have chosen not to do what they did. So how does one explain, at least plausibly hypothesize what motivated them? I think there are two or three things that have come together. One, the Chinese have been increasingly disconcerted by the Indian position on the management of the COVID epidemic. India has joined international calls for a transparent investigation, which in Beijing is seen as code for investigating the CCP's cover-up of the origins of the pandemic and so on and so forth. There has been a great restiveness in Beijing about India's new investment constraints on Chinese investments, especially in the high-tech areas, all done for legitimate reasons, but all the same signaling to China that India might be sort of finding common cause with the US in terms of technological constraints on Chinese companies. And then third, I think the Chinese have been looking at the Indian infrastructure modernization, particularly in eastern Ladakh, with some trepidation for years now. the Indians have come late to this game. China has been doing this for decades. And so they use this as a good opportunity to go out and stake claims, that were previously recessed. China has not done anything that is new. It has engaged in such activities, in the past. But this time it has done so with a certain ferocity, precisely because it wants to make a point that it can push back, it can assert its prerogatives, and it's pushing India to either accept this new status quo or engage in risk taking that might only make things worse. It's a form of bargaining through force.
I want to bring Ambassador Roemer into this part of the discussion, especially with respect to Washington's view. But before I do that, I just want to also point out one more thing, Ashley, that I thought compelling. Shamit Ganguly pointed out a few days ago that, when India and China in 1988 struck a pact of sorts to, focus on their domestic economies and not really be aggressors against each other, back then, the two countries shared very similar total GDPs. So they were, similarly matched economies. And of course, 32 years later, China's economy is 5 times or 4 times the size of India's, and it spends a similarly larger amount on defense. So the dynamics of the relationship have changed. Ambassador Roemer, obviously we know that President Trump offered to mediate, and that's not an offer that will be taken seriously, I think, either in New Delhi or Beijing. But more broadly, can you give us a sense of what these skirmishes and the dynamic between the two countries, what it means for the United States more broadly, given its ambitions in Asia?
That's a great question, Ravi, and I think it is a great opportunity for the United States, actually. We talk about the importance of soft power and diplomacy and the role of the State Department. We talk about the great kind of vision and role that our businesses play in being honest brokers and investing in social responsibility efforts around the world. Soft power and diplomacy are very, very critical weapons, so to speak, today in U.S. foreign policy. They're not being utilized nearly enough. In fact, I think there's a massive demoralization going on and an ignoring, a negligence of our soft power. On the other hand, in China, I think China is badly using and leveraging its soft power, which creates this opportunity for the United States if we can get our act together. China has, even before COVID-19, overplayed its hand in the South China Seas, aggravating the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and others. It has really come to kind of a war of words in the economy with Australia, putting new tariffs on all kinds of products that Australia has been selling because Australia came out early for this international investigation about COVID-19, and China didn't like that. Europe is now looking at the supply chain issue and saying that they have relied totally too much on China and they need a smarter, more diverse supply chain. That creates opportunities for the United States, Ravi. On the supply chain issue, we have to be very careful. Everything can't be reshored to America, although a lot should be. Where can we disperse smartly our supply chain to diversify that, maybe in places like India and Vietnam, and move it from China? What needs to stay in China that will make sense for businesses economically? But how do we make some of these decisions with our partners like India, who we want to grow this economic relationship with, and also break down some of the economic barriers and tariffs that India currently has on US products? So this soft power, this non-kinetic coalition building that Ashley has talked about, that I've talked about, that you have covered in your magazine. This is really essential in the next 10 years for us to build up our State Department, build up our morale, use this more effectively as we did after World War II and in the best of times in U.S. power, and combine the kinetic and non-kinetic powers in the best of U.S. tradition.
Okay, I'm going to start bringing in some questions now from our viewers from around the world. One of them is a follow-on from what you were just saying, Ambassador Roemer. It's a question from Sudarshan. I think he just left the conversation, so I can't call on him. But his question is that one hears about China plus one with respect to supply chain diversification all the time. So which Asian countries, he asks, are the top choices for US companies right now?
I would say that there's not one top choice. Many US companies that are currently in China are trying to think through carefully, thoughtfully, strategically, financially, what do we need to do? What stays in China? They're not going to move out of China for the most part. You know, the plants, the factories and so forth, most of those things will probably stay given US investment there. But new supply chains, new supply lines, new ways of doing business, sending a direct message to China on the business front with money and foreign investment speaks loudly. Would that go to a place like India? Now, India, as Ashley will be able to tell you in intimate detail, Prime Minister Modi needs to do a lot more to increase confidence for U.S. investment, foreign investment. E-commerce and medical stents and solar power. There are all kinds of obstacles for us to get in and do business. And this is an opportunity for India to break some of that down. Other countries in Asia, Malaysia and Vietnam make some sense, but also in the Trump administration and in the future Biden administration, reshoring, tax incentives to locate new supply chains in the United States rather than moving them, or reshore some from China to the United States might also be advantageous from a financial point of view, given some incentives that might be put together. What we don't want to do, Ravi, is just simply have Congress, who is working on this supply chain issue, play into the rhetoric of the presidential election coming up and be simply punitive to China. They need to look out for U.S. national security interests. What's smart for our workers and our middle class and our resilience of our supply line, rather than just punishing China.
Let me bring in some more questions from our viewers. I'm going to try and call on a couple of people. So when I do that, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, I'll give you 3 or 4 seconds to unmute yourself. If the tech doesn't work, I'll ask the question on your behalf. So I'd like to go to Dave Sutton from Lockheed Martin. You've typed in 2 questions in our meeting chat. Dave, if you're still there, you can hear us and would like to ask your question yourself, unmute yourself and go ahead. And if I can just ask you to direct your question either at Ambassador Roemer or Ashley, go for it.
Yes, absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
We can, go ahead.
Great. Yeah, sorry, I think that was a duplicate question, but good to hear from both of you as always, and maybe that can direct this to Ashley. As you know, I think, Ashley, you've seen that Indian leaders are really clearly grasping the opportunities, economic opportunities that are theirs post-COVID, as companies are relooking their exposure globally, and particularly to China, as Ambassador Roemer just noted. But there's still a number of major structural policy changes that they need to really incentivize proper investment. I think that there is a mindset that if we build it, or because we're here, they will come, and we know that there's still some things that need to happen. Mm-hmm. In the past, mere economic opportunity hasn't always proven, sufficient to spur those large changes. But I'm wondering if you're seeing any signs that kind of the growing security concerns around China's behavior might finally be kind of bleeding over from the national security sphere and helping to add some impetus to drive those economic changes, that really are strategic.
I see green shoots on that count, Dave. the government has, after many years, begun to look at issues in particular relating to infrastructure. So, for example, because acquiring land in India is such a difficult proposition, they're trying to create a carve-out where central authority identifies the land and creates a pool of land resources that might be available to companies that want to come. They are working with state governments, especially BJP state governments, to liberalize labor laws so that a certain degree of hire and fire can be introduced into the economy. In other words, what they're trying to do is a selective and piecemeal liberalization of factor markets, land, labor, and so on and so forth. But to my mind, they still have not engaged what I see as the background impediments to enabling companies to come in a big way. And what are those? I would identify three of them. The first is policy stability. India does not seem to appreciate that policy stability is critical for companies that are going to make huge investments over a multi-year period. You can't have policies changing in every budget and expect that private agents will bear the costs of your changed policies simply because you change your mind. Unless India recognizes that policy stability must be a multi-decade project, companies are simply not going to come. The second is using tax instruments as means of coercion. Companies want to come to India if they do in order to make a profit. They don't want to come to India in order to be held up at gunpoint because tax authority suddenly runs fiscal deficits which need to be compensated by, very aggressive tax measures. We've seen many instances of this in the last several years where India has engaged essentially in tax terrorism. So the whole question of managing, taxes becomes a critical thing. The third has to do with IP. It's something we don't talk about very much because China dominates, the IP theft world. India is not so much into IP theft, but India has very coercive policies on intellectual property, where India essentially wants companies to come, manufacture, and transfer their IP so that they can create domestic competitors to the foreign companies that originally brought the IP in. Now, if this is your national policy, why would any company want to take the risks of coming to India and manufacturing if it cannot protect its IP? Now, these are big policy questions. They are not structural problems of the kind that usually, we think of when we think of factor markets. So to my mind, India has just begun the process. It's recognizing the pressures and the opportunities that COVID provides. But unless it is willing to sort of take these bulls by the horns, I fear that, even the little that India is beginning to do will not yield the rewards it wants.
Thank you, Ashley. Let's get some more viewer questions. I'd like to go to Nayanima Basu of The Print in India. Nayanima, you had a question to Ambassador Roemer. If you are able to unmute yourself, we'd love to hear your voice.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So yes, if you can hear me, this is for Ambassador Roemer. I just wanted to understand how he sees the relationship, the dynamics have changed between the India and the US since the time he was the ambassador and today, when these two countries are, strategically more closer to each other in terms of Indo-Pacific and Quad. Also going forward, how do you see that will be strengthened in a post-COVID world? Thanks so much.
Thank you for the question. And I think one of the most important things in our relationship with India is the fact that bipartisan agreement is surrounding and embracing, deepening and strengthening this partnership going forward. Whether it's a Republican president or a Democratic president, we have all strongly agreed that India is a natural partner for us, whether that is counterterrorism agreements and historic homeland security arrangements and intel sharing that we initiated with President Obama, whether that is Bush or Clinton or Trump. I think all these administrations have recognized that these two great democracies going forward in the next several decades can do the kind of things that Ashley and I have been talking about this morning. Create the kind of economic partnership to have a win-win scenario with jobs being created in the United States and high tech being shared with India that will allow them to grow and protect themselves, where we can work together on health and climate and education initiatives. I would like to see the number of Indian students even surpass the number of Chinese students in the United States, and vice versa. We need more United States students going to study in India and doing research and helping on healthcare and other kinds of projects. Conversely, in India, we've also seen various parties support a stronger relationship with the United States, the BJP, the Congress Party, regional parties. When I traveled all over India, I always found strong support for this relationship. So I'm somewhat bewildered that as China oversteps and creates these faux pas and diplomatic missteps and angers other countries in the world, why doesn't India see this, take more advantage of that, work with the United States on opening up their economy more so that the United States can overcome some of these barriers of doing business with them, and the United States-India partnership becomes what US-China was in 1979. Not analogous, obviously, to it, but China grew at 10% for 3 decades with the United States' help. And ironically, the United States has helped China do this, and now we seem to have more divergence in the relationship than convergence. But the United States-India relationship, if India will act on it and do some things to bridge the economic conflict that we currently face, political stability, tax reform, foreign investment encouragement, these kinds of things could really take us from a strategic defense and intel relationship into a more solid and longer term and stronger economic relationship with a win-win scenario for both countries moving forward. I think that's what we should be working for, and I hope the Trump administration can look less at the deficit numbers between the United States and India in trade and more focus on the opportunities to create jobs in the US and do trade with India.
We have another question from Sabir Kumar Basak. I think he may have just left the conversation, so I'm going to pose the question on his behalf. We're at the 1 hour mark, but we're going to go a few minutes over so we can take more of your questions. So Shabir Kumar Basak's question, Ashley, I'm going to put this to you. He asks, how will US dominance with latest innovation in various sectors continue if the IP seepage continues in the way it has done over the last couple of decades? He goes on to say the marginal cost for China is very low to acquire tech know-how and compete for jobs and products. And especially, of course, just to add my thoughts on that, during the pandemic, it's quite likely that China is looking for opportunities around the world to step in. Ashley.
Well, I'm not persuaded by the fact that the US has ceased to be an innovation society. Most of the cutting edge innovations, despite great Chinese achievements in robotics and AI recently, most innovations still come from the United States. So it doesn't seem to me that we are going to lose our capacity to innovate. If you look at Chinese innovations, the Chinese do much better with respect to taking validated technologies, manufacturing them at scale, and bringing them to market. But they're not necessarily the best innovators when it comes to creating new technology and operating at the leading edge of the production possibility frontier. That's simply not true in China. So my take on this is that as long as we have stable property rights regimes internationally, as long as we can work through institutions like the WTO to protect intellectual property across national boundaries, US companies will continue to innovate, and the United States will continue to benefit from the innovations that it produces. For me, the fear is not our lagging capacity to innovate. For me, the fear is that we may not have a robust enough international regime that protects the fruits of our innovations. And if we cannot rectify the regime of protection, then I think we set ourselves up for all kinds of problems. And the US-China relationship at this point is a great testimony to exactly American anxieties about the infirmness of the global intellectual property regime.
Lakshma Reddy has a question, and Ambassador Roemer, I'm going to put this to you. It's sort of a two-part question asking, what the world oil and gas industry scenario will look like in the years to come. But she also goes on to ask why the US doesn't stand solidly with India on several issues. And that sort of plays into what you were describing as your bewilderment about that very issue. Your thoughts?
Again, when I served the United States in New Delhi as ambassador, the energy, solar, wind power, gas, natural gas, oil, this was one of our priorities, American priorities, to help our companies, to help our country provide more opportunity for India. India recognized then, I think under Modi today, even more so, that they need to bring in, cleaner, diversified sources of energy. How do we help India do that and accomplish those goals? And part of that is on India. Part of that is, not requiring these unachievable goals of requiring U.S. companies to have 30% or 25% local domestic content purchasing requirement. That eliminates us from the get-go to even compete to get in on many of the solar and hydro and wind power arrangements. So they have to change things in order to help themselves. Their citizens are more aggravated with the pollution. Now that we've had less planes in the air, factory lockdowns, social distancing, we have flamingos returning to Mumbai for the first time in decades and decades. Blue skies there in Delhi. People get used to that, and they want to find opportunities for diversification. On the LNG issue, this is something I worked hard on. I know my successors did. How do we try to work together to export the LNG capability when India has locked into some very expensive contracts in the Middle East previous to our relationship and with American firms? This is something that we've been increasing. I think it's now over $10 billion in LNG. That could go up even more. And the solar and wind and other areas are virtually unlimited.
Ambassador, you mentioned flamingos and bluer skies, but we also have locusts and cyclones, so it's a mixed bag. I want to pose a question from Sandeep Samadar to you, Ambassador. This is more focused on the United States, and he says that while the US was never a typical welfare state, these are his words, he says, as a post-pandemic economy, do you expect a shift in the debate on whether it can become a welfare state or will have the ability to become one?
Well, I do believe, Ravi, that Bernie Sanders will not be on the ballot. His name is not going to be on the ballot in November, but some of his ideas are going to be pushed by the progressive side of the Democratic Party. They will be discussed at the Democratic Convention. with the rising inequality in the United States, the 14, 15, 16% unemployment rates, the efforts to try to be creative in how we rebuild and restructure our economy. Bernie's ideas are going to be debated, and we certainly know from President Trump that he will call this socialism, and he will call it socialism versus capitalism rather than repairing and tweaking, capitalism to make it work better for the middle class and for the poor and for the 99% of people in this country that feel like globalization and other issues are not treating them fairly. I do want to say, to something that was said earlier, as great as the institutions post-World War II have been for us, it has probably been the last 10 or 15 years that they have not worked as well, that they've started to not be as strong, that other countries have been able to ignore them, particularly China. And whether we rebuild them, whether we reconstitute them, whether they're a weaker skeleton or never replaced, globalization, I think, is going to decrease in the future politically. I just don't see the support from the American people and from other communities across the world. So how does the business community deal with this? Do they say it's multilateralism and WTO or nothing? Or do we try to create bilateral trade with countries like India and forge a more specific agreement with countries that we want to do business with, that we can oversee, that we can maintain, that we can try to have a fair balance to and a win-win scenario to? How do we try to restructure this trade so that politically it's sustainable for the American people and not seen as a loser for the middle class? We need trade, there's no question about it. But how do we explain, Ravi, this trade in political ways to our American voters and people that make them believe that their lives benefit from engagement in the world and that we win that engagement? Right now, Trump has convinced them that we lose that engagement, and globalization and trade is not a good thing for the United States.
And I think part of that challenge is to see trade not as a zero-sum game, but as something else. We're almost out of time, so I just want to ask one last question to Ashley. And, we sort of began this discussion talking about how, the ideas, quote unquote, that are lying around are the ones that, have been pushed and have a lot of support behind them, but it is those ideas that tend to then succeed when a crisis breaks out. So Ashley, I want to ask you, we've talked about the notion of more socialist policies, but what one idea that is lying around do you think could catch on in a post-pandemic world?
I think there are actually two or three. The first actually has to do with healthcare. And I want to pick up the threads that from Ambassador Roemer's last remarks. There is absolutely no doubt that if we have to sustain a global trading system, whether it's multilateral or bilateral, we're going to have to show that there are gains from trade for the weakest and most vulnerable sections of our society. If we lose the political support from those sections of society, we cannot maintain trade. So we are going to end up having to bolster our safety nets. And dealing with the issues of healthcare are one very important way of doing that, simply because our record on healthcare is just abysmal. We spend the most for what is a very substandard record of achievement. So healthcare is one. The second issue will have to be how we manage carbon. And the whole questions of, taxing carbon in some way or another. And I think if you get a change in administration this November, issues relating to carbon policy will be right up there in the forefront. And the third will have to be a major state re-injection of resources into infrastructure. I mean, this pandemic is already showing us that, there are parts of the United States that are not serviced by a digital infrastructure, that don't have the access, cannot survive in this virtual marketplace because they don't have broadband and so on and so forth. And one can go and sing chapter and verse about our physical infrastructure as well. So issues relating to infrastructure, I think, would be three areas which are primed for much more energetic state intervention. And to be honest, I hope it happens because, we cannot simply expect the marketplace to produce its magic if you don't have an enlightened state that is guiding it. I mean, if you think about our performance during the Cold War, the reason we were able to win the Cold War was not simply because of American private innovation, though of course that was critical, but it was American private innovation in the context of very sensible policies that were national policies. The investments that were made in the in national infrastructure, the highway system, and so on and so forth. These are all examples of why you need a state that is rational, focused, and willing to look after the common good in order to create an environment for American private companies to work their magic.
Ravi, if I could just jump in on Ashley's very, I think, on-spot and provocative remarks there. We need a strategic framework for our relationship with China. We are very, very quickly going day by day right now toward the nadir in the relationship since we engaged with China in 1979. And the divergent issues of national security are dominating this and pulling us further and further apart, maybe not only toward fierce technology and economic competition, but hopefully not towards some kind of conflict by accident in the South China Sea or whatever. So we need a strategic framework. And I would give, I would say that Ashley's got 2/3 of it right here. If we could put together, we're going to have fierce competition in the relationship, but let's put guardrails around three areas where we can cooperate with China. Healthcare, I think that's one, with China's aging population and aging problems and aging costs. Two, I think climate, despite the Trump efforts to pull us out of climate cooperation, a lot of climate cooperation can take place with China at the state level and the business level. And three, I would say education. We have to put some guardrails around education so we can do exchange programs and not let the cyber and the spying and the problematic issues define this. China needs to behave better. They are obviously doing some things wrong, spying on the United States through education institutions. That needs to be cleaned up. But we have to get some areas of cooperation in this relationship, and fairly fast, around this strategic dimension.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we've gone over time. But I have to say, this was just such a fascinating discussion. I learned a lot. And I think, the best we can do in circumstances such as this, when we're all at home, is to engage with big ideas. And such a pleasure to hear from you both, and, with your frank views and conversation. Thank you also to our viewers around the world for listening, but also for participating and asking very intelligent questions. That's it for me. I'm Ravi Agrawal from Foreign Policy. I'm going to hand it over to Nisha now. But thank you once again, Nisha.
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you both to Ashley and Tim for just a really fascinating conversation. So much rich material, but what's clear here is that one, American leadership and engagement, and two, partnership with other countries like India are what are going to make the difference in the new world order that we see emerging in the post-COVID era. And so the U.S.-India Business Council will continue to focus on the opportunities as well as some of the challenges that both of our speakers identified that can help bring that about. We really look forward to working with all of you and helping to usher in an era where we can focus on more inclusive opportunity for the citizens of the United States India, and with our combined leadership and partnership, helping to also create more opportunity around the world. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for a really rich, interesting, and provocative conversation. And we look forward to bringing you more of these conversations in the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Be safe.
Have a wonderful day. Be safe. Be well. And we will see you in the near future.
Take care.
Ravi, thank you.
Thank you, Ravi.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy the weekend.
Thank you.